I'm sure we'll all be very grateful. It gives me great pleasure to start this Congress by introducing Professor Liu Dong from China, who is the President of the International Union for the History and Philosophy of Science, Division of the History of Science and Technology, which is the organisation under whose auspices this Congress takes place. And he will officially open the Congress.
Madam President, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's my special honor to be here this morning and on the name of the ICHTSM, Division of History of Science and Technology, to declare the commencement of the 24th International Congress of History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. 4 years ago in Budapest, when my honorable colleagues voted in the General Assembly to choose the University of Manchester to host the next Congress, I feel a great sense of pleasure and relief, not only because of the city of Manchester reminds us of the Industrial Revolution and the Victoria science and culture, but also we can rely because the city, more important, we can rely on and take pride the experience and the wisdom of our British colleagues in organizing large international events like this. Born in the triumphant age of the Industrial Revolution, the University of Manchester is associated with a number of world-famous scientists and scholars, including John Darwin, for example, Austin, Bernard, Joseph John Thomas, Ernst Rutherford, John Chadwick, Alan Turing, Ludwig Wittgenstein, if I am correct, among others. In addition to her renowned colleges, departments, laboratories, observatories, museums, and libraries, the university is home to the Center for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine, which is one of the most vibrant and productive research centers in our field. Indeed, football fans among us might liken it to be the Manchester United of the history of science. And one. Sorry for those of the Manchester City. And all Blackburn and I see. Oh, by the way, I heard there's still some seat available for the banquet, Congress banquet, in all the parking. Stadium, 55 pounds, but working twice, if you're not yet. I'm happy to learn from the local organizer that the total number of the registered participants in the Congress is 1,758, if not more, maybe not more. This is the largest Congress in my experience and perhaps the largest in the DHIT history. Also, I'm sure the Congress is expected to be the most successful in the DHIT history. If there had been any regret, it would have been the dazzling irony of the facility report and the symposium, and the rich and the diverse social activities are all in the same time, which that many fabulous choice. It was really hard to choose. We can imagine the amount of the hard work of the organizers have put into its preparation. Here, on behalf of the DHIT Council and the Congress participants from every corner of the world, I would like to thank our British Council. Society for the History of Science, the national organizing body for the Manchester Congress. This has provided intensive organizational and financial support, including grant scheme for overseas and student delegates. Professor Hasok Chang and Professor Sunny Hart. Thank you. Among the various organizations, the Wellcome Trust has provided intensive financial support for the Congress activities in the history of medicine and bioscience, including support for the student delegates. Visitor Manchester has also provided considerable financial support for the Congress social work. Most of all, the local organizing committee chaired by Dr. Jeffrey Hughes and Dr. James Sumner put in countless hours of work and suffered a lot of mental organizing. I think everyone got the small the USD. It's very wonderful just to here as a very excellent guide. So to in the line, you can find the detailed and accurate information. This is done by James. The James' work, I think he is better at his way, maybe than most technicians, although there is no pay. I would like also to express gratitude to both the ladies, Russia Abbott and Rosa Village, for their hard work and the support of the local organizing committee. Professor Frank James, my dear friend, the chair of the National Introductory Committee, who is also the ICHTSM council member, and the main person taking the initiative to bring the international conference. He has played a crucial role at both levels. I also appreciate the professional work done by the International Program Committee, guided by Professor Peter. In particular, I would like to thank the University of Manchester for providing excellent facilities, wellness, student dorms, as well as their moral support. Finally, but not less important, I will thank all of the young volunteers. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce President and Vice Chancellor of the University, Professor Nancy Rothberg, to speak.
Thank you very much indeed, and a very warm welcome to Manchester and to the 24th International Congress for the History of Science, Technology and Medicine. I'm delighted that you chose to hold this event in Manchester at the University. We're clearly in great company with past events having been organised in Mexico, Beijing and Budapest, and I hope that you enjoy your stay here. As you heard from Professor Liu, there is a strong history associated with both the University and the City of Manchester, and indeed the city is often referred to as the original model, the founder of much change in the Industrial Revolution, but also one that looks forward. The university also has a rich history, and you will be hearing some of that, I'm sure, during your presentations, but also hopefully as you tour around the campus. And you'll see some of that reflected in the names of the buildings, each of which commemorates an important past member of the university. We are actually the first civic university in the UK with roots back to 1824 when the Mechanics Institute was formed. And much of our history is thanks to the generosity of wealthy local people, of merchants, engineers and cotton traders and so on. For example, we have the first chair of nursing, the first chair of psychology in the country, but it's in science and engineering that in particular there's a strong history. And if I tell you one brief story, and that's of the E.R. Langworthy chair of physics. Langworthy, like many others, was a wealthy businessman from Salford, and in the late 19th century he decided to endow a chair, and it was called the E.R. Langworthy chair. The current holder of that chair is Andre Geim, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2010. And most unusually, Andre is the fourth holder of that chair at the university to have won a Nobel Prize. He was preceded by Rutherford Blackett Brown. And having just been awarded a Regius Chair of Physics, he will hand it on to Kostya Novoselav, who also won the Nobel Prize. So we'll have the fifth Nobel Prize winner holding that chair. So when Kostya relinquishes the chair, there'll be some pressure on the next holder of the chair. There's also a strong heritage in the history of science, technology and medicine here, dating back certainly to the 60s and 70s, to the work of Donald Cardwell and then Richard Hitchens. And they were really instrumental in founding the Museum of Science and Industry here in the city. And we'll be visiting that, I understand, at one of your events. And then, of course, we also have the Manchester Museum. So the Centre for History of Science, Technology and Medicine was founded in 1986 and already has a strong international reputation. It also has very strong local links, and it was the Centre for History of Science, Technology and Medicine that started the Histories Festival in Manchester a few years ago. That's become extremely successful, and many members of that centre have been involved in the organisation. I know with conferences of this type, I've been involved in organising a few of them and how much work goes into them. Many people have contributed. I do particularly want to mention local organisers Jeff Hughes, James Summer and Rachel Abbott. Thank you to all of my colleagues and to those from outside the university who have contributed to the working of this. I'm a scientist, a biologist, but I recognise the real importance of history and heritage to the discipline. Probably the most profound moment in my career was when you get to sign the book of the Royal Society, when you're made a fellow. And it was profound because they turn back the pages and you can see the names of Charles Darwin and Isaac Newton. And that has a real impact on any scientist. So I understand very well the importance of understanding history, not just for the past, but also for the future. So I'd like to welcome all of you, the President and Council for the International Union for the History of Science, Technology and Medicine, the members of the International Academy for the History of Science, the President of the British Society for the History of Science, delegates, particularly those of you from overseas. I hope you enjoy your time in Manchester, you get some time to look around, to particularly enjoy your visit to Old Trafford, even if you're not football supporters. Particularly thanks and welcome to Professor Liu. So it just remains for me to say you have more interesting things to listen to than me. I'm sure you want to get on with your conference, but I do hope you have a most enjoyable and informative time here in Manchester, and I hope the sun stays shining all week. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Nancy Rothwell for her generous words of welcome and for reminding us all of the rich history of science at this university. And it makes me particularly proud to be associated with the university as the third generation of my own family who studied here. We'll now have the platform party move down to the floor before we move on to the next stage of our opening ceremony. My next task is to welcome you on behalf of the British Society for the History of Science. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Society to this Congress and to Manchester. The BSHS, as we usually refer to ourselves, is the UK adhering body to the International Union for the History and Philosophy of Science Division of the History of Science and Technology. And it was the BSHS Council that took the perhaps fateful decision to bid for this Congress back in 2009. Since then, both here at Manchester and in the wider BSHS community, a large number of people have worked extremely hard to ensure the success of this event. And I'm sure I was not alone yesterday in experiencing both excitement and relief as all of you started to arrive. We hope that our decision to host this Congress will demonstrate clearly to the global community in our discipline that although we have British in our title, our interests and our membership are not confined to these islands. We are delighted that over 750 Congress delegates have taken up our offer to become temporary members of the BSHS, and we are pleased to learn from Cambridge University Press that many of them have already taken advantage of access to the BJHS, or British Journal for the History of Science, which is our journal, that comes with that membership. We would also like to extend a special welcome to those delegates whose attendance has been supported by the BSHS or the Wellcome Trust through bursaries. The distribution of these bursaries reflects our long-standing commitment to supporting students and early career scholars in our discipline, whose participation, we are convinced, enriches our events and ensures the vibrant future of our field. We hope that they and all our delegates will also take advantage of the opportunity at this event to go on one of the many tours or trips available each day, to attend one of the Congress fringe events, or just wander down to the Congress pub and taste some of our specially brewed beers. These aspects of the Congress reflect the commitment of the BSHS to ensuring that our meetings are both social events as well as academic gatherings. And we hope that we can tempt you back for more at our upcoming annual conferences to be held at St Andrews in 2014 and Swansea in 2015. These will provide a perfect opportunity to continue the conversations and friendships started here, as well as beginning new ones. My next task is to introduce our plenary lecture for this morning, and that is going to be delivered by Professor Hasok Chang, who is Hans Rousing Professor of the History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge. Those of you who already know Hasok will know that he is hugely respected as a scholar and an innovative and inspiring teacher. And we're delighted that he has agreed to deliver his BSHS presidential address as part of the opening events of this Congress. As appropriate for someone presenting in this international forum, he himself has a very international background. Having been brought up in South Korea, he moved to the United States for his higher education, studying first at Caltech and then taking his PhD at the University of Stanford. After a postdoc at Harvard, he moved to University College London, where he stayed for a number of years before more recently moving to the University of Cambridge. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Hasok Chang, who will deliver his presidential address, putting science back into history of science.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to wear this microphone, so please bear with me. Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Way back. Hello. Before I begin my actual lecture, let me just add a few quick thanks of my own. First of all, to Sally Horrocks, my predecessor as the ICHTSM president, not only for inducting me into this role so well and giving me such a generous introduction, but for playing such a crucial role in the organization of this huge congress. And I'd like to thank all my colleagues in the BSHS for trusting me with the office of president at this crucial time. You may regret it in about an hour. Usually the BSHS presidential address is given to a room of about 100 people, not to what's supposed to be the biggest gathering in the history of science, technology, and medicine in the history of the universe. It is my great honor to have this platform, and I hope I won't disappoint you too much. Thank you, Professor Liu, and everyone in the International Union for maintaining this wonderful series of international congresses, which I think is quite amazing. That is the 24th one, and it will keep going. And as everyone's already said, there's been so much work, care, and agony going into the organization of this Congress. And I must particularly again mention Jeff and James, Sally, Rachel, and Frank. Everyone else, from the stewards to the president of this university and the sponsors inside and outside Manchester who have helped us put this together. Now, it is my great pleasure to present a small gift. First of all to James, please. Everyone else will have to wait for their presents. And thank you all for being here. It is wonderful to see everyone. Now, on an occasion like this, bringing together people from all over the world for collective celebration and advancement of our field, I think it is also important to recognize the conflicts that exist within the field. And I would like to begin my remarks today by referring to one particular conflict. This revolves around the question of how we position history of science in relation to science itself. This issue has created some deep divisions which I think should be recognized, discussed, and healed. In history of technology and medicine too, I believe that similar divisions can be detected, though I'll only be speaking about science today as that's what I know best. So I would invite parallel or contrary reflections from historians of medicine and technology. The title of my lecture is a deliberately provocative and controversial one, and I hope you'll forgive me for that. I think on an occasion like this, it's actually not such a bad thing to have a little bit of controversy. At least it will give you something to talk to each other about, if everything else you hear this week is too sensible and boring. My title refers to some people's sentiment that in much current work in history of science, there's a trend to avoid engaging with the technical content of scientific knowledge, a trend that would be detrimental to the health of our discipline if it became truly dominant. Back in 1980, Science magazine attributed the following remark to Charles Gillespie under the title, History of Science, Losing Its Science. Gillespie was reported to have said, once a highly respected field, that focused on the conceptual evolution of scientific ideas, the history of science is losing its grip on science, leaning heavily on social history and dabbling with shoddy scholarship. Now that was an extreme expression, of course, but similar feelings have been expressed by many others. Here's Olivier Darigol, one of the scholars I most respect in our business. he says, he laments that most historians ignore the few histories that still make attempts at engaging the more abstruse, codified parts of scientific work, and underestimate them as fossils of an outdated historiographical tradition. So, the disgruntled internalists, as I shall call them for a moment, they say, if all we want to study is the history of scientists, not science, and their institutions and their social and cultural determinants and influences, if we want to insist that science is just another socio-cultural phenomenon, if we're not going to deal with the distinctive practices of science producing knowledge, then there's no clear reason, they say, why we should have a separate field of history of science, with our own independent department, societies, or journals. In that case, we should just join the ranks of general historians and declare history of science obsolete. Now, it's certainly nice when other kinds of historians recognize science as an important part of society, and also when history departments give us jobs. But content-free analysis of science cannot constitute the entirety or even the core of a discipline properly called history of science. That's one side. On the other side, of course, there are a number of people who say that joining general history departments is precisely what we should be doing, and many of you have done so. They feel that historians of science should be first and foremost properly trained historians with methods and sensibilities shared with other historians. Catherine Olesko, editor of Osiris for the last decade, declared that the 11 volumes that she edited were, quote, designed to dissolve boundaries between history and the history of science, unquote. On this side, people often worry that focusing on the content of science without attention to its social and cultural context prevents a well-rounded understanding of the development and significance of science. Some of the more impatient contextualists have been frustrated that we still cannot seem to get rid of the dinosaurs who don't have a real sense of history and just want to talk about science. Looking more positively towards the future, Olesko and Robert Kohler surveyed the cutting edge of Anglophone scholarship in history of science last year and detected the following popular themes: communication and circulation, place and space, publishing and print culture, and late meanings and uses of science, among others. They consider these themes to be the concepts with the promise to take our field beyond an aimless profusion of micro-studies in the aftermath of the demise of grand narratives. Now, it would certainly be possible to use these themes to frame content-focused research, but in actuality, this doesn't happen very much. Scientific content is just not a preoccupation in this round one. By now, the Young Turks have become established figures, and social and cultural history of science is the order of the day, at least in some countries. But the old argument is not over, and the conflict is still real, even though the picture I've just given you is, of course, a crude caricature. As late as 2007, Kostas Gavroglou and Jürgen Rand still reckoned that the tension between the focus on content and on context was responsible for much of the acrimony presently prevailing in our field. The causes and consequences of this tension need to be addressed urgently and at a deep level. Of course, many people have tried to bring the different perspectives together, and I only intend to continue and build on their efforts. Many examples, but for one, Anna Maria Goldfarb and her colleagues have called for an articulation of a distinct identity of the historian of science as a scholar committed to bringing three spheres of analysis together, which she calls internal, contextual, and historiographical. I don't know how much this call from São Paulo and other comparable ones have been heard around the world. Before giving my own positive view on this issue, I would like to clear away some widespread misconceptions, which can be expressed as a set of false dichotomies. First of all, there's a persistent notion that social history and intellectual history are mutually exclusive opposites. Against that idea, we need to remember those classic works which demonstrated brilliantly that social and intellectual analysis of science can be coextensive, including the works of Peter Galison or Andrew Pickering on modern physics, the sociological reductionism of the Strong program in the sociology of scientific knowledge, and Stephen Shapin and Simon Schaffer on early modern epistemic and social order. Cultural history is also often held up as the opposite of intellectual history, and this is very puzzling to me. I mean, only people from very anti-intellectual cultures could imagine cultural as the opposite of intellectual. As Robert Thornton put it in The Great Cat Massacre, the meaning of cultural history is that it treats our own civilization in the same way that anthropologists study alien cultures, capturing the otherness of the past to understand it in its own terms, to unravel an alien system of meaning. But this is precisely what intellectual historians of science have been doing to science for many, many decades. The alleged contrast between cultural and intellectual only comes because one perversely excludes science from culture and then looks for its so-called cultural context. Similarly, there's a widespread view that if we concern ourselves with the rationality of science, then we cannot do social or cultural history, or vice versa. For this misconception, philosophers of science and the internal historians of science are just as responsible as those allegedly on the other side. We need to get beyond this misconception and learn to recognize, with a whole line of thinkers ranging from Merton to Habermas to Kitcher, that rationality is something fully embedded in and dependent on social, political, and institutional settings, but not meaningless for that reason as a normative guide to practice. One more. We also need to lose the habit of equating the content of science with theories or ideas. Scientific content is embodied in all epistemic aspects of scientific practices, including not only ideas and theories, but experiments, facts, models, arguments, know-how, inventions, technological applications, materials, and instruments. The dichotomy between theory and practice is generally spurious, as shown most clearly by some excellent works on theoretical practice of theory, right? For example, by Andy Warwick and more recently, David Kaiser. Now, I think the greatest harm comes from the fact that all these false dichotomies tend to get lined up together, as I've shown on that slide, reinforcing each other and creating a misleading binary view of our business. And all of those dichotomies have also been mapped onto the external-internal distinction, that old thing that we all love to hate now. But I think actually the internal-external distinction can be cogent and useful. Dudley Shapiro has a reformulation of the distinction which can be helpful. Shapiro takes the internal as what has been internalized in a particular epistemic community. So internal considerations are based on a body of beliefs that have come to be accepted beyond any specific and practical doubt, due to the success and coherence of scientific inquiries made on their basis. Such beliefs, Shapiro says, constitute a basis on which science can alter its domains and build further hypotheses, methods, rules of reasoning, and goals. Now, I would broaden this notion to incorporate other aspects of scientific practice rather than just beliefs. But that's not so much relevant now. The most important thing for now is Shapir's insight that the internal-external distinction is forged in the very process of investigation of nature, not laid down in some edict from heaven or philosophy which determines what counts as scientific and what does not. So if we take the distinction in this way and free it from the misassociation with the false dichotomies discussed earlier, it can help us distinguish different kinds of questions in history of science that demand different modes of inquiry. So that revived sense of internal and external is what I will mean when I use those terms in the rest of the lecture. So, all that was preparing the ground, and here are finally my points. History of science has some very important functions that cannot be served unless we engage with the content of science and do so with independent critical judgment. I emphasize that this is not to say that it doesn't have other kinds of valuable functions, only that the functions I'm going to talk about today tend to be insufficiently emphasized. Engaging with the content of science while exercising our own judgment is what I really mean by putting science back in the history of science. In order to realize the full potential of history of science, we historians need to be people of scientific discernment. As an instructive comparison, take Peter Winch's view on the history of art. He says, a historian of art must have some aesthetic sense if he or she is to understand the problems confronting the artist of his period. And without this, he will have left out of his account precisely what would have made it a history of art, as opposed to a rather puzzling external account of certain motions which certain people have been perceived to go through. There's every reason, I think, to apply this insight to history of science as well. Now, among today's historians of science, the conventional wisdom is that our business is to describe past scientific knowledge and perhaps explain how it came to be the way it was. But we do not and should not pass judgment on it. This is almost a reflex we now have. Many a student's wrist is slapped every day in history of science classrooms for violating this taboo. I think this is an incoherent, misleading, untenable, and harmful attitude, which we need to abandon before we can talk seriously about the functions of history of science. And I think we've ended up with it as a result of a misguided overreaction against traditional Whiggish history of science. It is often assumed that the sins of Whiggism in judging past science according to the criteria of present science can only be avoided by suspending judgment altogether, either through the kind of epistemic neutrality advocated in Kuhnian internal history, or in the impartiality principle of the Strong Program, for example. But this is an extreme response. As Nick Jardine says, all too often recent historians of science have abandoned common sense in their flight from presentism. So what can we do? Well, to fight Whiggism, which I think we should most of the time, we only need to make sure that our view of past science is not dictated by current scientific orthodoxy. It is not necessary to abandon all judgment. And neutrality, in fact, is a judgmental stance, only disguised as non-judgment. I mean, in the realm of politics, would anybody consider that it was not a political act for Switzerland or Austria to declare itself a neutral nation? In the historiography of science, the refusal to endorse the more modern-sounding view can actually be a powerful tool of pluralism or even of dissent. Personally, I remember feeling that forceful, liberating effect of neutrality when I first read Kuhn's account of the Copernican revolution, with his sympathetic description of how the Ptolemaic geocentric system of astronomy worked and made sense. The claim of neutrality, I think, has worked as a useful defensive shield for those historians of science whose dedication to their chosen topics in fact showed a strong critical judgment, namely that there was value in the dusty old systems of science that scientists themselves had discarded as outdated and worthless. Why else would you want to spend all your life deciphering Galileo's true meaning or anything else you want to do? But history of science as an academic discipline, I think, is now strong enough to throw off that shield of feigned neutrality against the shallow and harsh judgment of scientists. What we need instead, as Paul Foreman put it, is a declaration of independence. We can have a self-confident conception of historiography as practiced by free and responsible agents. We should start by admitting our own inevitable rootedness in present society and science. But the question is, which part and which version of the present do we choose to take as our platform? I find inspiration in Foreman's exhortation to historians of science to embrace the obligation to decide for ourselves what is the good of science, and by our historical research and writing, to advance that good. Foreman lamented the extraordinary intellectual subservience accepted by historians of science in comparison to the situation in history of philosophy, literature, visual art, and music, where the historian also functions as a critic exercising independent judgment. And it is important not to mistake this as an anti-science stance. That would be like saying that a movie critic is against movies. Now, finally, let me present you with a list. A list of those functions of history of science that require engagement with scientific content with independent judgment. This essentially is my argument. And really the point is that this is a rather long list. By functions here I mean both the inherent aims of the business, roughly the first 4 items on my list, and the applications of the business for other aims, the last 3. In talking about the last 3, I'm taking seriously John Heilbron's call for applied history of science. So first, there's an aim of history of science that maybe all of us can agree on, to make sense of scientific knowledge as a dynamic entity that develops over time through contingency. This aim is so obvious to historians today that it may not even seem worth stating, but we must not take it for granted. Out there in the wider world, the enlightened common sense still says that scientific knowledge advances inexorably towards the truth. Many scientists, philosophers, journalists, and others continue to expound the inevitability of scientific progress and the absoluteness of scientific truth once found. As Robert Rutherford said concerning political history, we must teach history precisely because so much bad history exists in the world already. The notion of the contingency of scientific knowledge requires continual defense and reassessment based on epistemic judgment concerning a growing body of concrete historical episodes. For myself, a formative experience in this regard was making my own detailed study of the chemical revolution, the experiments and arguments that form the substance of it. And that's summarized in the first chapter of my recent book. And that is the structure of chapter 1. What happened with this work? Despite my honest efforts, I could not convince myself that there were good enough reasons in the late 18th century to abandon the phlogiston theory. And I mean good reasons according to the standards of judgment that were shared among chemists at the time. Nor could I see any deterministic external causes which could explain Lavoisier's victory. Therefore, I had to face up to the judgment that formed within myself that the majority of scientists in the late 18th century made a misjudgment concerning phlogiston. Whether they were influenced by Lavoisier's rhetoric, or by a metaphysical bias, or by a sheer bandwagon effect, or anything else. Recognizing this complex contingency of a key event in the history of science had very significant effects on my thinking and on my practice as a historian. Next on my list of the functions of history of science is the study of scientific methodology and its evolution. Historians these days tend to avoid even mentioning the scientific method. It helps if you take the "the" out, but not entirely. This is unfortunate, though understandable as an allergic reaction to some very bad philosophy of science. With my philosopher hat on, I can assure you that many of us in the philosophy of science have been working very hard to move beyond the kind of philosophizing that puts historians off. I assure you it is safe to work with us again. And that philosophical work can connect very well with discussions of styles and ways of knowing, such as advanced by John Pixton here in Manchester. It is important that we acquire sensible ideas about the methods of science, partly again because there are such bad ideas about them already out there, and they harm science education and science policy. And if we want to learn about scientific methods, there is really no alternative except to turn to history. Critical judgment is again essential here because we cannot discern good and valid methods without making judgments about which instances of scientific were good and which weren't. Now I want to come to two functions of history of science that I think are very unjustly neglected in usual historiographical discussions. Regarding the third one, who used to talk about getting into someone's head? Aside from being an injunction for historians to lose modern prejudices, as you jump into John Dalton's head, I believe that this idiom expressed the sheer joy of understanding how someone from the distant past saw the world. Heilbronn has been explicit in stating that a historian of science should be a connoisseur. The renunciation of the pleasures of a connoisseur would be a huge loss to our culture. What we have here is the business of appreciating past scientific knowledge in itself for its own sake. In the mode of art that I have called complementary science, the recovery of forgotten knowledge is a major aim of historical work, and this covers facts as well as ideas. There's no time to go through this in detail, so I'll show you just one brief glimpse at what sort of thing one could learn from long-forgotten past science. So when I was doing my research on thermometry, which was my previous book, I repeatedly came across 18th and 19th century texts reporting that the temperature of boiling water depended on a whole variety of circumstances. So they claimed that even pure water under standard atmospheric pressure would boil very differently, depending on how exactly it was boiled. And that is all true. What you see in the video that's about to play is my replication of a phenomenon reported by Jean-André de Luc of Geneva in 1772, though, as you see, clearly not his exact experimental arrangement. What happens, the question is, what happens if one boils water with a low temperature heat source, such as the hot plate there, which is made possible by cutting down the surface area of water through which heat loss happens. So long, thin-necked flask will do that job. As you see, as the temperature of the water approaches 100 degrees, it starts to boil in a normal way. As boiling continues, however, the temperature continues to rise, while the bubbles get bigger but less frequent. They also come more irregularly, often in bursts. The temperature goes over 100 degrees, easily reaching 101, 102, again under normal pressure, while the boiling is reasonably steady. With continued heating, the bubbles can become even less frequent, while temperature creeps up further. At this stage, we can observe what the look called puffing, with long quiet periods, punctuated by very large bubbles. Sometimes the puffs are explosive, drawing water out of the flash. It's about to do that. The trial shown in this video produced a temperature of 104 degrees during puffing. This is nothing like boiling as we know it, but entirely consistent with what the look reported in 1772. Recovery. Function 4. In addition to recovering neglected knowledge from the past, historical research can extend scientific knowledge by stimulating new thinking. Perhaps the most illustrious example of this is in the work of Martin Rodwig, who took methodological ideas from Cuvier to help him in, I quote, reconstructing the mode of life of extinct invertebrates, or brachiopods, which was successful despite hostility and opposition from paleontologists who could not think that anything good could come from someone pre-Darwin, especially an anti-evolutionist whom I was using for evolutionary purposes. Thank you, Martin. In my own work, I have noted how recovered scientific knowledge can be extended, as I will illustrate again with a very brief example. This comes from my current research on the early history of electrochemistry. I was very interested to learn that Volta used salt water rather than acid or anything else more exciting as the electrolyte in his battery, the wet stuff. This very mundane piece of recovery stimulated my modern curiosity about the electrochemical properties of salt NaCl solution, and led to some interesting new experiments. For example, while attempting to learn more about the mechanism of electrical conduction in the solution, I discovered that a gold anode will dissolve in salt water on applying a voltage roughly between 2 and 3 volts, as seen here. A little later, you have a slightly clearer view of that yellow stuff just hissing down from the gold wire. And much over 3 volts, it stops. Chlorine gas comes out instead. This phenomenon has surprised every chemist that I've shown it to, and its investigation may yield some interesting new chemical knowledge. Or it may not, you will have to see. Now, once all 4 of these aims are met, there's much else we can do with history of science, so the applied functions now. Many people have advocated the introduction of serious history of science in science education. This is an idea easily advocated and seldom practiced, despite the successes of some initiatives going all the way back to Project Physics by Gerald Morton and colleagues at least. This is a function of history of science that we cannot afford to neglect. By not connecting better with science education, we historians of science are abandoning millions and millions of science students at all levels, being tortured with bad history. And we must also remember that most science teaching is directed to those who will not become professional scientists. Therefore, it is a civic mission for us to consider how the teaching of science can be improved for the education of better citizens. And it should go without saying that such educational functions of history cannot be served without a close critical attention to the content of past science. History of science can also facilitate the bridging of the gap between different ways of scholarly thinking, so memorably caricatured by C.P. Snow in his description of the 2 cultures, which still has a strong resonance despite the withering criticism by David Edgerton and others. Situating science in its cultural context surely helps, but that needs to be complemented by a content-side strategy. A true cultural understanding of the work of science requires an empathetic appreciation of its content. The history of science provides the most suitable material, obviously, for such scientific education of non-scientists. In the other direction, what better humanist education of scientific people could there be than a convincing demonstration that the very content of long-established scientific knowledge embodies contingent human actions and strivings. Finally, it is an important function of science studies in general to challenge the authority of scientists when and where they deserve it. Scientists, like all other figures of authority, need external scrutiny by well-informed people with good judgment. But questioning scientific orthodoxy is not something one does lightly, and judgment must always be made responsibly. This makes it all the more essential that our work should be grounded in a sound understanding of the content and methods of science. We need to get into the heart of the content of the relevant science and command the respect of the scientists that we mean to challenge. For example, witness James Cushing's painstaking technical historical work, showing the contingency involved in the establishment of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Even when the debate is about present science rather than past science, the knowledge of history gives us perspective and judgment, and exactly the kind of judgment that practicing scientists tend to lack. All 7 of these functions are important, and they can only be served through detailed attention to scientific content. By neglecting these functions, I think history of science impoverishes itself and diminishes its own significance very unnecessarily. We cannot let methodological fashion or dogmatism limit the potential of our field to benefit scholarship and society. There is too much at stake. And it is not impossible to learn the science that we need, even if you don't have scientific training. Surely anybody can learn the phlogiston theory much more easily than learning, say, Latin or Chinese, the kind of thing that historians routinely do. Now, I admit, of course, that there are other functions of history of science that do not revolve around scientific content, but attention to content is not useless or futile, even for those who want to concern themselves exclusively with the study of science as a social, cultural, political, economic, or material phenomenon. Even a purely anthropological study would need to be informed by some understanding of the beliefs and practices of the tribe of scientists that we want to study. A real anthropologist studying another society's religious